My name is Daniel Mercer. I am employed as a seasonal fire lookout for the Forestry Service, assigned to an isolated tower deep within protected woodland. I am trained to observe, record, and report. My responsibility is to watch the forest for smoke, lightning strikes, and signs of human intrusion. I was taught that accuracy matters more than interpretation, that a logbook is not a diary, but a factual record. What follows is written according to that standard. Everything described occurred within a single 24-hour period, beginning at first light. I arrived at the tower shortly after sunrise, having hiked the final service trail alone. The access road had been washed out earlier in the season, which was not unusual. My pack was weighed and checked according to protocol. Food for 7 days, water filter, radio, backup batteries, flare kit, first aid, and the issued logbook sealed in a waterproof sleeve. The previous lookout had left early due to a family emergency. There was no overlap shift. Only a short note attached to the inside of the door stating that the area had been quiet and that weather conditions were stable. The tower itself was standard 4 legs anchored into rock, a narrow staircase, and a glass-walled cabin at the top. Inside, the furnishings were minimal and functional. A cot, a folding table, a propane stove, and the observation desk positioned beneath the windows. The logbook was placed in the center of that desk, exactly where it was meant to be. I opened it to the first blank page and recorded my arrival time, weather conditions, and visibility. I signed my name clearly, using block letters. As required, by mid-morning I had completed a full sweep of the surrounding forest. Visibility was excellent. No smoke. No movement inconsistent with wildlife. The radio check in with base went through without interference. I reported normal conditions and was instructed to maintain routine observation. There was nothing unusual to note, and for several hours that remained true. A forest behaved as forests are supposed to. Wind moved through the canopy in predictable patterns. Bird calls came and went. Shadows shifted slowly as the sun climbed. It was just after noon when I noticed something that did not belong. Using the binoculars, I scanned a low ridge approximately 2 miles east of the tower. At first, I thought I was seeing exposed rock through the trees. The shape was wrong. Too symmetrical. I adjusted focus and realized the clearing was not natural. Trees had been cut or removed in a rough circle, their stumps weathered and dark. At the center of that clearing was a structure made of stone. Not a building, but a formation. Upright slabs arranged deliberately, casting short, sharp shadows. I recorded the sighting in the logbook with precise language, noting location, distance, and visual characteristics. Unauthorized land modification was a reportable issue. I radioed base, but the signal degraded unexpectedly. Static overwhelmed my transmission after only a few seconds. I attempted again with the same result. Equipment failure was uncommon but possible. I logged the communication issue and continued observation as procedure dictated. Throughout the afternoon, I returned to the clearing repeatedly. The light changed, but the structure remained clearly visible. There was no movement around it. No vehicles, no people, no smoke. It looked abandoned, yet recent. The cut tree edges were not fully gray. This suggested activity within weeks, not years. That fact unsettled me more than the structure itself. Protected land is monitored. Trails are logged. Ritualistic vandalism was not something covered in training manuals. As evening approached, the forest began to quiet in the normal way. Insects replaced birds, The temperature dropped. I prepared a simple meal and logged routine observations. At 1840, I made another attempt to contact base. The radio powered on, the indicator light steady, but only silence came through. No static this time. Just an absence, as if the channel were empty rather than blocked. I noted this carefully, choosing my words to avoid speculation. Dusk arrived quickly. From the tower, I could still see the clearing, though details softened as shadows stretched. The stone formation seemed darker than the surrounding forest, absorbing what little light remained. I considered using the tower's spotlight, but regulations discourage unnecessary illumination, unless responding to an emergency. At that point, there was no emergency, only an unresolved observation. At 1912, I heard a sound from below the tower. It was not loud, but it was distinct. A single, dull impact, followed by another. Stone against stone. I froze and listened. The staircase was visible through the floor opening. Nothing moved there. The sound came again, distant, carried upward through the trees. It matched the rhythm of deliberate action, not falling debris or animal movement. I wrote while listening, my pen moving slower than usual. At 1918, the sound stopped. The forest went quiet in a way that was not consistent with nightfall. Even insects seemed muted. I stood and returned to the binoculars, aiming them toward the clearing despite the fading light. I could no longer see the individual stones clearly, but I could see that something was different. The shape had changed. One of the upright slabs was no longer standing where it had been hours earlier. I felt a strong urge to leave the tower and investigate. That impulse concerned me because it was not rational. Night travel through dense forest without backup is explicitly discouraged. I reminded myself of protocol and stayed where I was. I logged the change in the structure's configuration without assigning cause. Facts only. At 20:03, I found something I had not written. I was reviewing the earlier pages of the logbook to ensure consistency when I noticed an entry dated months before my assignment. It described the same clearing, using similar measurements. The handwriting was not mine, nor did it match the previous lookout's note. The entry ended abruptly mid-sentence, as if the writer had been interrupted. I closed the logbook and listened to the forest. From somewhere far below, stone struck stone again, slower this time, as though whoever or whatever was there no longer needed to hurry. I remained in the tower, aware that the logbook in front of me was no longer just a record, but a warning written by someone who had stood exactly where I was now sitting. I did not sleep. That is not an exaggeration or a dramatic choice of words. I lay on the cot with my boots still on, the logbook resting on my chest, listening to the forest exist in a way that felt deliberate rather than natural. The tower creaked occasionally as the temperature dropped, metal contracting in slow, tired movements, but those sounds were familiar. The others were not. There was a pattern to the quiet, a sense that noise was being withheld rather than absent. At 20:47, I resumed writing. I recorded my inability to rest and the persistent awareness of activity originating from the eastern ridge. The pen scratched louder than it should have in the silence. Each time I paused, I found myself holding my breath without realizing it. When I forced myself to inhale normally, the sound felt intrusive, as if I were interrupting something already in progress. I returned to the observation desk and adjusted the binoculars again. Night had fully settled, but moonlight provided enough contrast to outline the clearing. The stone structure was more difficult to discern now, yet its presence felt stronger, not weaker. One of the slabs reflected light differently than the others, angled in a way that suggested intentional repositioning. I was certain of that. I had memorized the arrangement earlier, not consciously, but through repeated checks. This was not a trick of shadow. At 21:05, the radio activated on its own. There was no incoming voice, no static burst. The unit simply clicked and hummed as though someone had pressed the transmit button, elsewhere on the same frequency. I reached for it immediately and spoke my call sign, keeping my voice even. No response came back. The indicator light remained solid for several seconds, longer than expected before shutting off again. I documented the incident, noting the duration and lack of audible signal. I did not write how my hands shook afterward, because that was not relevant to observation. Minutes later, I noticed movement near the base of the tower. Not footsteps, not climbing. Something passing through the undergrowth, just beyond the reach of the structure's shadow. I leaned toward the window, careful not to press my face against the glass. The movement stopped the moment I focused on it. No animal sounds followed. No retreat. It was as if whatever had been there simply chose not to continue. I considered using the spotlight again. I even placed my hand on the switch, thumb resting against the plastic edge. The feeling returned, stronger now, urging me not to illuminate the forest. The thought was clear and immediate, arriving fully formed rather than reasoned through. Turning on the light would be rude. I withdrew my hand and stepped back, disturbed less by the thought itself than by how easily I accepted it. At 21:32, I heard voices. They were distant and indistinct, carried unevenly by the terrain. There was no shouting, no laughter, none of the sounds associated with hikers or campers. The voices did not rise or fall in normal cadence. They maintained a steady tone, overlapping without interrupting one another. I could not identify words, only rhythm. The sound came from the direction of the clearing. Against my better judgment, I wrote a verbatim description of the voices in the logbook, including my inability to parse language. As I did, I noticed another entry appearing beneath my writing. Not physically forming in front of me, but already present on the page when I looked back. The ink was faded and brown with age. The handwriting was tighter than mine, cramped as though written under strain. It described the same voices. The entry referenced a sequence and a window of completion. It mentioned that observation from elevation was safer, though it did not explain why. The final line read, "Do not acknowledge them until the stones are finished moving." There was no signature. I closed the logbook again, harder this time, the sound echoing inside the small cabin. The voices stopped immediately. The silence that followed was absolute, pressing in on the tower from all sides. I waited for my ears to adjust, for insects to resume their noise. Nothing did. The forest was holding its breath. At 22:10, I heard footsteps on the stairs. They were slow, deliberate, and heavy enough to register through the structure. Each step produced a dull vibration that traveled up the metal frame. I stood frozen beside the desk, eyes fixed on the stairwell opening. The steps ascended halfway and then stopped. I could picture exactly where whoever was there would be standing, just below the platform, close enough to hear my movements if I made any. I did not move. I did not speak. I did not write. After several minutes, the footsteps descended again, retracing each step with the same unhurried pace. When they reached the ground, I heard stone strike stone once more, closer now than before. The sound carried upward clearly, no longer muffled by distance. Whatever was happening in the clearing was nearing completion. At 22:41, the moon passed behind cloud cover, and the clearing vanished from view entirely. That was when the smell reached the tower. Earth, wet stone, and something metallic beneath it. Blood has a distinct sharpness that I recognized immediately, though there was no visual confirmation of its source. The air inside the cabin felt heavier, more difficult to breathe. I checked my watch repeatedly, grounding myself in the passage of time. All of this was still happening within a single shift, a single day. That fact mattered. It meant there would be an end even if I could not see it yet. At 23:03, I felt a vibration through the tower that was not caused by movement. It was rhythmic, repeating at intervals that matched the earlier sounds of stonework. The structure beneath me resonated with each impact, as though the ground itself were responding. I found myself standing again, binoculars raised despite the darkness, searching for any sign of change. Then the voices returned, closer now, clearer in tone though still incomprehensible. They were no longer coming from the clearing alone. Some echoed from directly below the tower, circling it at a measured pace. I realized, with a cold certainty, that the ritual described in the logbook was not meant to be hidden. It was meant to be observed, and that meant I was already part of it. At 20:30:19, the voices stopped again, but this time the silence did not feel like restraint. It felt like completion. The rhythmic vibration beneath the tower ceased, leaving behind a faint residual tremor that faded slowly, as though the forest itself were settling after prolonged tension. I remained standing, binoculars still raised. Long after it became clear there was nothing more to see, I forced myself back into procedure. Panic has no place in documentation. I sat at the desk and resumed writing, recording the time and the abrupt end of auditory activity. My handwriting was less precise now, though still legible. I noticed my sentences were shorter, stripped of unnecessary detail, as if my mind were conserving energy. I did not mention the sense of being watched from multiple angles. I did not mention the certainty that whatever had been circling the tower no longer needed to move. At 23:41, the radio activated again. This time, sound came through. It was not static, nor was it a voice in the conventional sense. It was a low, sustained tone, modulated slightly, like breath pushed through a narrow opening. I did not respond immediately. I waited, counting seconds, listening for variation. After 12 seconds, the tone shifted upward, becoming sharper, almost questioning. I keyed the mic and stated my call sign and location, my voice steady through training alone. The tone stopped. In its place came a series of short clicks, evenly spaced. I recognized the pattern with a slow, sinking dread. It matched the cadence of the stone impacts I had been hearing all night. The realization settled fully before I could stop it. The ritual was not confined to the clearing. It was communicating. I shut the radio off completely and disconnected the battery. The silence afterward was immediate and profound. For several minutes, nothing happened. No footsteps, no voices, no vibrations. The forest seemed to resume its natural state cautiously, insects beginning their calls in scattered, tentative bursts. I allowed myself to sit, shoulders slumped, exhaustion catching up to me all at once. I must have closed my eyes, because the next thing I knew, the cabin was brighter. Not with artificial light, but with the pale gray of approaching dawn. My watch read 04:58. I had lost nearly 5 hours. There was no memory of sleep, no dreams, only a blank span of time that felt excised rather than passed through. The first thing I did was check the stairs. They were empty. No marks. No debris. I checked the ground below through the windows. The undergrowth was undisturbed, as if nothing had ever moved there. The smell from earlier was gone. The air felt clean, cold, and ordinary. I told myself that mattered. As the sun crested the horizon, the clearing came back into view. I raised the binoculars with deliberate care, bracing myself for what I might see. The stone formation was intact, complete in a way it had not been before. Where there had been gaps and uneven spacing, there was now symmetry. Every slab stood upright, aligned precisely, forming a closed ring. At the center of the circle was something new. A shallow depression had been carved into the earth, darkened and smooth, as though repeatedly worn down. There were no bodies, no obvious remains. Whatever had been used there had been removed, or perhaps had never been intended to stay. The clearing looked finished, not abandoned. That distinction chilled me more than any sign of violence. I recorded everything. The time, the light conditions, the final configuration. My logbook entry for that hour was longer than any other I had written so far. When I finished, I turned the page and found a new entry waiting. The handwriting matched the earlier unknown writer. The ink was darker now, less faded, as though written more recently. It stated simply that the observation period was complete, and that the site would remain dormant as long as it was left undisturbed. The final line thanked the lookout for maintaining elevation and restraint. I closed the book carefully and did not open it again. At 06:15, base radioed in. The signal was clear, strong, unaffected by interference. They asked for a routine morning check-in. I responded with standard phrasing, reporting no fires, no weather concerns, and no visible human activity. My voice sounded normal to my own ears, though I felt detached from it, as if listening to someone else speak. They informed me that a relief team would arrive later that day to assess the tower. There had been a discrepancy in assignment records, a clerical error that resulted in overlapping documentation for the site. I acknowledged the message without comment. When the transmission ended, I sat quietly, waiting for the forest to react. It did not. Hours passed without incident. The clearing remained still. No voices returned. No stones moved. By midday, the sense of pressure that had surrounded the tower all night had fully dissipated. If not for the logbook, I might have convinced myself that exhaustion had manufactured the entire experience. The relief team arrived shortly after 1400. Two rangers climbed the stairs, chatting casually, their presence grounding in its normalcy. They asked routine questions, inspected equipment, and reviewed my entries. Neither commented on the detailed descriptions of the clearing, though I noticed one of them pause briefly while reading, brow furrowing before smoothing out again. When they finished, I was told I could leave early. My assignment would be transferred, pending further review. No explanation was given, and I did not ask for one. I packed my gear methodically, following checklist order. Before sealing my pack, I looked at the logbook one last time. The final page I had written on was blank again. My detailed entries from the night were gone, replaced by a single line stating that conditions had remained normal throughout my shift. I handed the logbook over without protest. As I descended the trail away from the tower, I felt the forest watching me, not with hostility, but with acknowledgement. I understood then that the ritual site did not require belief, participation, or even understanding. It required only observation and silence. The logbook was not meant to warn future lookouts away. It was meant to ensure that someone would always be there, to witness the moment when the stones finished moving. I did not leave the forest immediately. That is the first thing I need to state clearly, because it explains everything that followed. Although I had been released from duty and escorted partway down the service trail, I did not reach the access point where vehicles could meet me. Instead, I stopped at a marked junction less than a mile from the tower and waited until the relief team's voices faded completely. Only then did I turn off the trail. This was not panic or confusion. It was intent, quiet and steady. I told myself I needed to confirm something for the report I would eventually be asked to give. That justification felt reasonable at the time. It still almost does. The forest looked different in daylight, but not in the way people expect when fear dissolves under the sun. The trees were unchanged. The terrain was familiar. What had shifted was scale. Distances felt compressed, as though the land had subtly folded inward overnight. I checked my compass twice to ensure I was heading east. The needle held steady. I did not carry the issued logbook with me. That had been taken. What I did have was a small personal notebook, blank except for a name and emergency contact, written on the inside cover. I began recording again as I walked, noting time and landmarks out of habit more than necessity. The urge to document had not faded with the night. If anything, it had sharpened. By 15 to 10, I reached the outer edge of the clearing. From the ground, the stone circle appeared larger than it had from elevation. The slabs rose above me, each one different in texture and color, yet aligned with unnatural precision. There were markings carved into some of them, shallow enough that they vanished when light struck from the wrong angle. Others were smooth, polished by repeated contact. I avoided stepping inside the ring, stopping several feet short. The air within the circle was cooler. Not dramatically so, but enough to be noticeable against the warm afternoon. Sound behaved differently there. My breathing seemed muted, absorbed rather than echoed. I wrote that down, then hesitated, pen hovering, unsure how to describe the sensation of being observed without movement or sound. I circled the perimeter slowly, counting steps between stones. The numbers repeated. That should not have been possible given the irregular shapes, yet each gap measured the same pace. When I reached the far side, I noticed something embedded in the soil just beyond the ring. A metal tag, partially buried, stamped with a faded serial number. It was a forestry marker. The number corresponded to an old lookout designation, one that had been decommissioned decades earlier. I knew this because I had memorized the regional maps during training. That lookout had never appeared on modern charts. According to records, it had been dismantled after a lightning strike caused a fatality. There was no mention of a body being recovered. I did not pick up the tag. I photographed it with my phone, then stepped back, uneasy with how easily the forest seemed to allow my presence. No birds fled. No insects scattered. It felt less like permission and more like indifference. At 15:42, I heard movement behind me. Not footsteps. Weight shifting. Fabric brushing against stone. I turned slowly and saw a figure standing just inside the circle. He was dressed in outdated field gear. Canvas jacket, sun, bleached and frayed at the cuffs. His boots were old issue, the kind no longer in service. He did not look injured. He did not look distressed. He looked focused, eyes fixed on the stones as though awaiting instruction. I spoke before thinking, asking if he was with the service, if he needed help. My voice sounded loud in the clearing, intrusive. The man turned his head slightly, just enough to acknowledge me. His expression was calm, almost relieved. "You're late," he said. The words were clear, unaccented, spoken without accusation. I felt a sudden, sharp certainty that he was not referring to me personally, but to the role I occupied. I asked him how long he had been there. He considered the question carefully, then shook his head once. "Until it's done," he replied. I did not ask what that meant. I already knew. The man stepped backward, deeper into the circle, and placed his hand against one of the stones. His palm fit into a shallow depression worn smooth by countless repetitions. He closed his eyes and exhaled slowly. The air shifted. I felt it pass through me like a pressure change before a storm. I backed away instinctively, every training instinct screaming to leave the area. As I retreated, the forest seemed to resume its natural behavior. Birds called. Leaves rustled. The clearing itself remained unnaturally still, isolated from the surrounding life. I did not see the man leave the circle. When I turned again, he was gone. I returned to the trail without running. I did not look back. By the time I reached the access point, the relief vehicle was waiting, engine idling. The ranger driving asked where I had been. I told him I had taken a wrong turn. He nodded, unconcerned. That night, at home, I slept for nearly 14 hours. No dreams, no interruptions. When I woke, the first thing I did was check my phone. The photographs I had taken of the clearing were gone. Not deleted. Never saved. The image that remained was a single blurred shot taken unintentionally, showing the edge of the stone circle, and reflected faintly in one slab, the outline of a tower standing where no tower existed anymore. I did not report the encounter. There was no mechanism for doing so that would not result in dismissal or confinement. Instead, I waited. 2 weeks later, a new assignment notice arrived in my email. Another fire lookout position, deeper inland, marked as historically inactive, but recently reopened. Attached was a digitized copy of a logbook entry dated nearly 50 years earlier. The handwriting was tight and familiar. It described a clearing east of the tower and noted that the stones had not finished moving yet. I accepted the new assignment without hesitation. That fact should concern me more than it does. At the time, it felt less like a choice and more like a correction, as if something that had been misaligned was finally returning to its proper track. The tower was farther inland, reachable only by a seasonal road and a long hike. Officially, it had been reopened for survey purposes, a trial placement to reassess coverage gaps. Unofficially, no one volunteered for it. I arrived in the early afternoon, the sky clear, the forest calm. The tower was older than the last one, its metal dulled by decades of exposure. The stairs complained under my weight, but the structure held. Inside, the layout was familiar enough to be comforting. Observation desk, cot, stove, radio. The smell was different, though. Old wood and dust, layered with something faintly mineral, like stone warmed by sun. The logbook waited for me on the desk. It was not new. The cover was worn, the edges softened by handling. I recognized the handwriting immediately. Tight, controlled, efficient. My own. Though written decades before I was born. I stood there for a long moment before opening it, aware that the act itself felt ceremonial, whether I intended it to or not. The most recent entry ended mid-page. It noted weather conditions. visibility, and a reference to a clearing west of the tower this time, not east. The phrasing was precise, restrained. There was no panic in it, no alarm, just observation. I turned the page and found several entries missing entirely, torn out cleanly. The absence felt deliberate, curated. I wrote my name on the next blank page. The letters came easily, my hand steady. I recorded my arrival time and conditions, mirroring the format I had used before. As soon as I finished, the sense of being watched receded slightly, as if acknowledging my presence had satisfied some requirement. The first afternoon passed quietly. I performed routine scans, noted distant weather patterns, and tested the radio. Communication with base was clear. No interference, no unexplained activation. By sunset, I had almost convinced myself that the previous site had been an anomaly, a convergence of exhaustion, isolation, and imagination reinforced by old records. Then the light began to change. The forest below the tower darkened unevenly, shadows deepening in bands rather than gradually. Through the binoculars, I saw a break in the trees to the west. Smaller than the last clearing, but unmistakably shaped by human hands. Stones were present, fewer in number, arranged loosely, as though waiting for instruction. I did not report it immediately. Instead, I watched, noting how the light caught on the stone edges, how the surrounding vegetation bent subtly inward, leaning toward the formation. At 1822, I wrote a single line in the logbook describing the clearing's location and composition. The words felt insufficient, but they were correct. Night fell faster than expected. Insects began their calls, but the rhythm was uneven, punctuated by long gaps of silence. I prepared food and ate mechanically, my attention never fully leaving the windows. When I returned to the desk, the logbook was open to a page I had not turned to. An entry had been added. It welcomed me back and noted that continuity had been maintained. It stated that elevation remained optimal and that interference had been minimized this cycle. The final line instructed patience. The stones would move when the forest was ready. I did not close the book this time. I left it open, as if to prove that nothing else would change when I wasn't looking. Hours passed. No voices came. No footsteps climbed the stairs. The night felt restrained, held in check by some unseen boundary. Sometime after midnight, I felt it again. The subtle vibration through the tower's frame, barely perceptible unless one was attuned to it. I stood and placed my hand against the metal wall. The vibration matched a distant, measured rhythm, slower than before. Fewer stones, perhaps, or fewer observers. I checked the time and wrote it down. The act grounded me, gave the sensation a shape. Outside, the forest seemed to lean inward, listening. I did not feel fear then. I felt usefulness. Just before dawn, the vibration stopped. The clearing, when it became visible again, had changed. One stone now stood upright where none had before. Its surface was smooth, worn by hands, marked faintly with grooves that caught the morning light. The logbook recorded this without my prompting. When base radioed in for the morning check, I answered calmly, reporting normal conditions. They asked if I was settling in. I said yes. They reminded me to document anything unusual. I looked at the clearing once more before responding. I am. I told them, and meant it. As the sun climbed, I understood something with quiet clarity. The stones did not require belief or worship. They required maintenance. Observation ensured alignment. The logbook ensured continuity. And the forest ensured that those who were suited to the role would always find their way back to the tower. no matter how many years passed between shifts. By the time evening approached again, I was already watching the shadows, waiting for the next movement, confident now that when it happened, I would be ready to write it down. The second night at the inland tower began without ceremony. That alone felt intentional. No sudden drop in sound, no pressure change in the air. The forest behaved normally, as though determined to convince me that nothing was about to happen. I did not trust that impression. I had learned that restraint was part of the process. I kept the lantern low and did not use the spotlight. The logbook remained open on the desk, its pages unmoving. I wrote only when something changed, forcing myself to wait between entries. Time mattered. Sequence mattered. The earlier entries, written by hands that were not entirely separate from my own, emphasized that repeatedly without explanation. At 1906, I noticed movement in the clearing. Not the stones themselves, but the vegetation around them. Grass and low brush bent inward, flattening slightly, as though pressed down by passing weight. No figure appeared. The motion followed the curve of the stones, completing a slow circuit before stopping at the upright slab. The air inside the circle shimmered briefly, distorting the view like heat above asphalt. I documented the change precisely, resisting the urge to add interpretation. My pulse was steady. My breathing remained controlled. That, too, felt like compliance. The vibration began again shortly after. It was faint. Barely more than a suggestion felt through the soles of my boots. This time, it was irregular. 2 impacts, a pause, then 1. I counted them automatically, jotting the sequence in the margin. The pattern repeated 3 times, then ceased. The logbook page shifted slightly as if nudged by a breeze, though the windows were closed. A new line appeared beneath my writing. It corrected my count. I stared at it for a long moment, then adjusted my entry without argument. The relief that followed surprised me. Being corrected implied oversight. Oversight implied order. At 27:11, the radio clicked on briefly and then off again. I did not touch it. I did not log it. The instruction to minimize interference echoed in my mind, though I could not recall reading it anywhere. Outside, the forest settled into a deeper quiet, insects thinning out until only a few remained, their calls spaced too evenly to be natural. I stood at the window and watched the clearing. The upright stone caught moonlight along its edge, a thin silver line that shifted as clouds passed overhead. For a moment, I thought I saw a reflection there, the outline of a tower that was not mine. When I adjusted my angle, it vanished. The smell returned around 2100. Damp earth, stone dust, and that metallic sharpness I refused to name aloud. It did not fill the cabin. It remained localized, drifting in through the eastern window, as if guided. I closed the window slowly, carefully, feeling that abrupt movements might be noticed. The smell lingered anyway, faint but persistent. Footsteps began on the stairs at 21/24. They were lighter than before, more numerous. Multiple sets, overlapping slightly but never colliding. I did not approach the stairwell opening. I remained at the desk, pen in hand, ready to write if instructed. The steps stopped just below the platform again. No attempt was made to climb further. I realized then that elevation was not merely safer. It was sufficient. A voice spoke from below, calm and conversational. "Still watching?" said. I did not answer. The statement did not require confirmation. The footsteps retreated after a moment, descending in the same overlapping rhythm. When they reached the ground, the vibration resumed, steadier now, more confident. The logbook page turned on its own. The next entry described progress. It referenced alignment and noted that fewer adjustments would be needed at this site. The language was efficient, almost satisfied. I added the time in the margin, my hand steady. I did not question why I knew where to write. Near midnight, the clearing changed again. A second stone tilted upward, grinding softly against the earth. The sound carried clearly despite the distance, a low, resonant scrape that set my teeth on edge. I watched it rise millimeter by millimeter until it locked into place beside the first. The vibration stopped immediately afterward. The forest exhaled. Sound returned in a rush, insects resuming their calls all at once, leaves stirring as a breeze passed through. The sudden normalcy was almost disorienting. I sat heavily on the cot, exhaustion pressing down on me without warning. I checked the time and wrote it down, then forced myself to remain awake. Sometime between 0100 and 0300, I lost continuity. I do not know when my eyes closed or how long I was unresponsive. There were no dreams, no images, only an awareness of standing elsewhere for an indeterminate span. When I became aware of the tower again, dawn light was filtering through the windows. My watch read Yo 5:12. My pen was still in my hand. The logbook had been filled. Several pages were covered in writing, none of it frantic, all of it precise. The entries detailed minor adjustments, confirmations, and final measurements. The last page ended with a note stating that this site would require only periodic observation going forward. The wording implied a longer interval between visits. Decades, perhaps. I felt an unexpected pang at that. The thought of the stones standing unattended, unwitnessed, unsettled me more than their movement ever had. At sunrise, the clearing looked ordinary. The stones were still there, but without the context of night and vibration. They resembled a weathered art installation, or an old boundary marker. If I had come upon them by chance, I might not have looked twice. That realization felt intentional. Base radioed in at ZO 6030. The transmission was clear. They asked for a status update. I reported no fires, no weather issues, and no notable activity. As I spoke, I realized that was true in the narrow sense they required. They told me to continue my assignment and thanked me for the detailed logs. The phrasing was odd. They had not yet reviewed them. When the call ended, I closed the logbook gently and placed it back at the center of the desk. The urge to leave, to return to normal life, felt distant and abstract. Here, there was purpose. There was structure. There was a role that only a few ever occupied, stretched across time rather than space. As the morning wore on, I caught myself scanning the forest not for smoke, but for subtle misalignments. Shadows that fell wrong. Sounds that broke rhythm. The work had shifted, and so had I. I understood then that I was no longer simply assigned to the tower. I was part of the interval. Morning passed with a deceptive ease. Sunlight warmed the cabin, lifting the chill left by night, and the forest resumed its ordinary rhythms with practiced confidence. Birds called from the canopy. Wind threaded through branches in gentle, familiar patterns. If I had arrived fresh that day, without memory of the previous night, I might have accepted the scene at face value. That possibility unsettled me more than the night itself. I continued my duties as assigned. I logged visibility, weather, and minor shifts in wind direction. Each entry felt slightly misaligned, as though I were recording the wrong variables. My attention kept drifting back to the clearing, though nothing there appeared to change. The stones stood as they had at dawn, quiet and inert, giving no sign that they had ever moved at all. The logbook remained closed. I resisted the impulse to open it again. Something in me understood that excessive attention carried its own risk. Observation was necessary. Interference was not. At 118, I noticed the first discrepancy. A trail that should have been visible from the tower was gone. Not overgrown, not obscured by shadow, but absent entirely, as if it had never been cut through the forest. I checked the map pinned beside the desk, then checked again through the binoculars. The terrain where the trail should have run was unbroken woodland. I made a note of it, careful with my wording, stating only that a previously documented path was no longer visible. The logbook shifted slightly beneath my hand. I did not open it. I finished the sentence and set the pen down. By midday, the sense of compression returned. Distances below the tower seemed to shorten and lengthen subtly depending on where I focused. The clearing appeared closer than it should have been, then farther away when I looked again. My compass remained steady, needle unwavering. The distortion was not directional, it was contextual. I ate lunch standing at the window, eyes on the forest. I realized then that I had not felt hunger in the usual way since arriving. Eating had become procedural, something done to maintain continuity rather than satisfy need. The thought did not alarm me. It felt appropriate. At 13:07, I heard the sound of a vehicle. It was faint and distant, the low rumble of an engine struggling against uneven ground. No vehicles were scheduled to approach the tower that day. I moved to the western window and scanned the access road through the trees. Nothing appeared. The sound persisted for several minutes, drawing closer without resolving into a visible source. Then it stopped abruptly. In the silence that followed, I became aware of something else. The stones were not casting shadows. The sun was high enough that shadows should have been sharp and distinct, yet the clearing appeared flat, uniformly lit, as though light were being absorbed rather than reflected. I raised the binoculars and confirmed it. The stone's edges were clear, their surfaces detailed, but no shadow fell at their base. I opened the logbook. A new entry waited on the page I had last written on, though I was certain I had closed the book the night before. The handwriting was calm and precise. It noted that midday anomalies were expected as alignment stabilized and advised continued observation without adjustment. The final sentence stated that curiosity was a variable best left unmanaged. I closed the book again and stepped back from the desk. The forest reacted immediately. Wind picked up, branches shifting, leaves flashing their pale undersides as they turned. The sound was sudden and forceful enough to make me flinch. Then, just as quickly, it settled. The clearing shadows returned, faint but present, stretching slightly to the north as they should. The message was clear. In the afternoon, a figure appeared on the ridge south of the tower. He stood just within the tree line, partially obscured by branches, close enough that I could make out his posture, but not his face. He wore modern clothing, dark jacket, neutral pants, a pack slung over one shoulder. He looked like a hiker or a surveyor. Someone ordinary. He raised one arm slowly, as if to wave. I did not respond. He remained there for several minutes, arm lowering gradually when no acknowledgement. I watched him turn in place, scanning the forest around him. When his gaze reached the clearing, he stiffened. Even at that distance, I could see the change in him, the way his weight shifted backward, away from the stones. He did not run. He backed away carefully, step by step, until the trees swallowed him again. I logged the sighting, describing only what I could verify visually. Human presence at a distance. No approach, no interaction. The act of writing steadied me. The forest remained quiet. As evening approached, clouds gathered low over the canopy, flattening the light. The air grew heavy, pressing down on the tower with the promise of rain that never came. I felt the familiar anticipation settle in, not fear this time, but readiness. Night was not a threat, it was a phase. At 1859, the vibration returned. It was subtle, barely perceptible, like the echo of something vast moving far away. I placed my hand against the desk and felt it there, steady and slow. Outside, the clearing darkened unevenly again, shadows pooling around the stones, while the surrounding forest remained visible. The logbook opened on its own. The entry was brief. It stated that an external observer had nearly engaged and that non-interference had been maintained. It commended restraint. The final line instructed preparation. A convergence window was approaching, and additional attention would soon be required. I sat down heavily, pulse quickening despite my efforts to remain calm. Preparation for what was not specified, but the implication was unmistakable. The stones at this site were nearing completion, just as the previous ones had. When they finished moving, something else would begin. The first drops of rain struck the tower roof at 1922, sparse and widely spaced. They did not fall on the clearing. I watched the rain skirt the circle, entirely the ground within remaining dry, while the forest around it darkened with moisture. As night settled in again, I realized that the interval I belonged to was narrowing. Observation would soon require more than watching from elevation. The forest had allowed distance, patience, and silence. That allowance was ending. I remained at the desk, pen poised above the page, waiting for the moment when the stones would demand a closer witness, and knowing, with a certainty that felt borrowed from the logbook itself, that when that moment came, I would not be given the option to refuse. The rain stopped as abruptly as it had begun. One moment it tapped lightly against the roof. The next it was gone, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt manufactured. Clouds hung low over the forest, unmoving, their undersides glowing faintly with reflected starlight. The clearing remained dry, the stones untouched by moisture, their surfaces dull and expectant. I did not write immediately. The logbook lay open waiting. The pen rested between my fingers, ink ready. For the first time since arriving, I felt the weight of hesitation. Preparation, the entry had said. Additional attention would be required. I understood then that observation from elevation was no longer sufficient. The interval was tightening. At 2011, the vibration changed. It was no longer distant or subtle. It pulsed through the tower's legs in a slow, deliberate rhythm that matched my heartbeat after only a few seconds. I pressed my palm flat against the floor and felt it there, steady and insistent. Each pulse carried with it a faint scraping sound, stone against stone. Though the clearing was too far away for such detail to travel naturally. The logbook page turned. The new entry was longer than most. It described the necessity of ground level confirmation once alignment reached a critical threshold. It noted that prior observers had resisted this step, often unsuccessfully. The language was not threatening. It was instructional, almost sympathetic. The final sentence stated that proximity would not increase risk if conducted before completion. Before completion. I stood slowly, joints stiff, and moved to the window. The clearing looked closer than it had earlier that day. not visually enlarged, but spatially nearer, as though the forest between us had thinned. Fog gathered at the tree line, rolling inward, but stopping short of the stones, forming a loose perimeter around the circle. At 20:34, a light appeared within the clearing. It was not fire, nor artificial illumination. It glowed softly from the ground itself, outlining the bases of the stones in a pale, diffuse halo. The light pulsed in time with the vibration, brightening and dimming in measured intervals. I felt an unmistakable pull then, not a command, but an invitation framed as obligation. I gathered my jacket and flashlight. I did not take the radio. I did not close the logbook. Leaving it open felt necessary, as though severing my connection to the tower prematurely would constitute abandonment. I paused at the top of the stairs, listening. No footsteps echoed below. No voices waited in the darkness. The forest accepted my descent without comment. Each step away from the tower eased the vibration slightly, though it never vanished entirely. The trail toward the clearing was clearer than had been earlier. Undergrowth parted just enough to allow passage without resistance. Fog clung to my legs as I walked, cool and damp, but it did not obscure my vision. The stones remained visible the entire time, their faint glow guiding me forward. When I reached the edge of the clearing, the sensation of compression intensified. The air felt denser, heavier to breathe. Sound behaved strangely again, my footsteps muted, my breathing absorbed. I stopped several paces from the ring, heart pounding now despite my efforts to remain calm. The stones were taller up close. Their surfaces bore countless marks, shallow grooves, hand-worn depressions, faint symbols that suggested repetition rather than decoration. This place had been used, not built. Maintained, not created. I stepped closer. The vibration surged briefly, then steadied. The light brightened, casting my shadow inward toward the center of the circle. I realized then that the stones were oriented not toward each other, but toward an absent focal point. Something that was not there yet. I did not enter the circle. I remembered the man I had seen at the first sight, the way he had stood within the ring with practiced ease. I was not meant to replace him. Not yet. At 21:02, a voice spoke from behind me. "You can see it now," it said. I turned slowly. The speaker stood just beyond the fog line, his features indistinct, posture relaxed. He did not approach. He did not need to. His presence felt anchored, as though he belonged to the clearing more than the forest around it. I asked him what would happen when the stones finished moving. The question came out quieter than I intended, swallowed by the air. "They stop," he replied simply. "And then?" I asked. He considered this, head tilting slightly. "Then the interval closes." I understood enough to be afraid finally. "What happens to the lookout?" The figure smiled, a small, almost apologetic expression. "There's always another," he said. "Sometimes sooner. Sometimes later." The vibration intensified again, the light flaring brighter. One of the stones shifted, tilting inward by a fraction of an inch. The sound it made was deafening up close, a deep grinding that reverberated through my bones. The figure stepped back into the fog and vanished. I retreated instinctively, heart racing, every nerve screaming to put distance between myself and the circle. The forest parted for me again, guiding my steps with unsettling efficiency. Behind me, the vibration continued, steady and relentless. When I reached the base of the tower, the stairs seemed impossibly steep. I climbed without stopping, lungs burning, and pulled myself back into the cabin, slamming the trapdoor shut behind me. The vibration lessened immediately, returning to its earlier, distant pulse. I collapsed into the chair at the desk, shaking now, and wrote everything. The proximity, the light, the voice, the stone's movement. I did not censor myself. The pen moved quickly, urgently, as though trying to outrun something. When I finished, the logbook accepted the entry without alteration. Outside, the forest grew still once more. The fog receded, thinning until it vanished entirely. The clearing's light dimmed, leaving the stones dark and inert again. I knew then that I had crossed a threshold. Observation from elevation had ended. Ground level confirmation had been completed. The interval was closing, and whatever came next would not involve waiting. As midnight approached, the vibration began to slow. Each pulse stretched longer than the last, the rhythm dragging, heavy with finality. I watched the clearing through the window, unable to look away, aware that when the stones made their final adjustment, the role I had been filling would change irrevocably. I stayed awake, eyes fixed on the darkness, waiting for the moment when the stones would stop moving, and knowing, with a clarity that settled deep in my chest, that when they did, the forest would no longer need me to watch. It would need me to remain. The vibration did not stop all at once. It slowed, stretched and thinned, each pulse farther apart than the last, like a failing heartbeat that refused to end cleanly. I counted them without writing, afraid that marking the final moments might somehow hasten them. The clearing remained dark, the stones motionless, but the sense of pressure persisted, coiled and patient. At $47, the final pulse came. It was softer than the others, barely perceptible. More felt than heard. The tower did not react, no creak, no shudder. The forest did not exhale this time. It simply continued, as if nothing of consequence had occurred. I waited. Minutes passed. Then an hour. The logbook remained open, silent. No new entries appeared. The absence felt deliberate, a confirmation rather than an omission. Whatever sequence had required documentation was complete. When dawn began to break, it came gradually, gently, without drama. Pale light crept through the trees, lifting shadows and restoring depth to the forest floor. I raised the binoculars one final time and examined the clearing. The stones were unchanged. They stood exactly as they had before midnight, upright and aligned, their surfaces dull in the growing light. The shallow depressions remained at their bases, worn smooth by hands long gone. There was no glow, no fog, no distortion. If someone else had been there with me, I might have struggled to explain why this place mattered at all. That, I realized, was the point. At Yo6CO2, the radio crackled to life. Base asked for a morning check-in. Their voices were clear, relaxed, unaware. I responded with the same calm cadence I had used every morning of my career. No fires. No weather concerns. Visibility good. Conditions normal. They thanked me and signed off. I closed the logbook for the last time. It was heavier than it should have been when I lifted it, dense with years that were not mine. For a brief moment I considered taking it with me, preserving what had been written, proving to myself that the night had been real. The thought passed quickly. The book did not belong to me. It never had. By late morning, a vehicle arrived at the access point. A ranger I had never met climbed the stairs, friendly, efficient, already scanning the interior with professional curiosity. He asked routine questions, glanced at the equipment, and reached for the logbook. "Quiet shift?" he asked. "Yes," I said, and watched the words settle comfortably into place. He nodded, satisfied, and made a brief note of his own. I did not watch what he wrote. It was not my place anymore. When I descended the trail for the final time, the forest did not watch me go. It did not acknowledge me at all. Birds moved freely through the branches. Insects hummed and crawled. The land had closed around the clearing again, folding it neatly back into itself. At the trailhead, I stopped and looked back once. From that distance, the tower was just a structure against the trees, unremarkable and temporary. Somewhere beyond it, the stones stood silent, aligned, waiting. Not for movement, not for sound, but for time to pass. I understood then what the interval truly was. It was not the night. It was not the ritual. It was not even the lookout. It was the space between attention and forgetting. Someone would always be assigned there eventually. Someone observant. Someone quiet. Someone willing to write things down, exactly as they happened, and accept, when the page stopped answering back, the stones would remain still until that moment came. And when they began to move again, the forest would make sure that a lookout was watching.